Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. I'm going to give a few words this afternoon on the topic of time and space, mostly from the point of view of the Abhidhamma, how it's understood in that way of thinking, that school. Begin with space. Well, first we should back up a little bit and lay a framework by speaking about what's been called the Dhamma theory, the description of reality as being composed of dhammas. Dhammas are, in the Abhidhamma system, dhammas are the ultimately real, and the ordinary objects that we perceive are composed of multitudes of dhammas, and they don't have any reality outside of the act of cognition, meaning that our minds construct a perceived reality from sense impressions that derive ultimately from the dhammas. The idea of the world being composed of dhammas is kind of an atomic theory. An individual dhamma has been called a point instant. It's a very brief occurrence, and it only exists as a result of causes and conditions, as a confluence of factors. And it doesn't have any independent reality outside of that. So the confluence of factors themselves constitute the Dhamma. And the Dhamma itself then acts as a cause for subsequently arising Dhammas. And no object without a cause, and no object from a single cause. So external reality can be perceived or conceptualized as a network of forces interacting, and where these intersect and react, that only exists for a moment as a Dhamma. What is described in the Abhidhamma as a real existent, a Parimatta or ultimate Dhamma. And anything composed of those, such as a person or an inanimate object, are called panyatis, or constructed objects, because they're constructed by the mind out of dhammas. It's a way of making sense of the field of reality. So that's the background for a brief description of the Dhamma view of reality, a background for understanding space and time. Space is considered a little differently in the Theravada and Sarvastivada, and so is time, for that matter, we'll get into that. In the Theravada, there are two kinds of space: akasa, space itself, and akasa dhatu, space element. To deal with the latter first, akasa dhatu occurs in a list such as the 6 elements. There's the 4 elements of matter, and sometimes that's expanded to 6, taking earth, air, fire, water, consciousness, and space. elements 5 and 6 are consciousness and space. And space here is considered conditioned, but it's understood in a limited sense as only being a space and emptiness, a void in material objects. So it's conditioned in this sense. If you dig a hole to make a well, then that hole is space. It's akasa dhatu. And it's conditioned because it comes from causes and conditions. You dug it out and you could fill it in. So it's conditioned. And this kind of space sometimes is related to a contemplation of the body, in that the body has akasa dhatu. There are voids and hollows in the body, such as the interior of the stomach, the interior of the mouth and sinuses and so on. There are voids or spaces in the body as part of the body contemplation. Contemplation of space element can also be one of the Kasina meditations, in which case it's understood in this sense as not as outer space, but a space empty, a void within, a holding place. Ajahn Sumedho has taught on contemplating space element as a way of approaching emptiness, is to pay attention to the space. For example, in a room like this one, we tend to think of a room as composed of a floor and walls and a ceiling, but that's actually only the container for the space, which is actually the useful part of the room. But it's the delimited space. It's conditioned by the walls and the ceiling and the floor. And it's a way of playing with perception to understand it better, to understand the working of perception, to try and perceive things as space and the boundaries as secondary. It's like a figure ground sort of flip. Normally we take the container as the primary thing and we disregard the space. But if you try and perceive objects in terms of space, delimited by their boundaries, then you can develop a new perception. The other kind of space is just plain akasa, which is sometimes modified as boundless or immeasurable. This is the space that is without limit. It's the boundless, what we would call in modern terms outer space or cosmic space. And to the Theravada teachers, Nabhidhamma, it was considered as not having any independent reality. So it was neither conditioned or unconditioned because it's unreal. It's only a way of speaking. It only exists as defined by objects. If there were no objects, there would be no space. But because there are objects, such as, say, planets, we say there's space between the Earth and Mars. They measure it in so many kilometers. That's only really like a mathematical abstraction. There's really no reality corresponding to the concept of space. Sarvastivada, on the other hand, while the concept of akasa dhatu, conditioned space, is the same, they did allow a reality to boundless space, and they considered it as an unconditioned. So this is one of the principal differences between the Theravada and Sarvastivada way of thinking is that Theravada always wanted to keep the idea of unconditioned solely for nibbana, whereas Sarvastivada added space to the concepts that were unconditioned. So space, to that view, is a kind of external reality. It's an actual existent, but it's not affected by anything else, and it doesn't affect anything, so it's unconditioned. It's just a ground in which objects are situated. Now we could maybe go a little further and say that, at least in some conceptions of modern understanding of physics, would take a third position again and say that this is coming like from Einstein's relativity, that space is a real existent, but it's also conditioned. Because objects condition space, the mass of gravity warps or conditions space. But in all of these views have in common that space is primarily to be understood as a container for objects, and objects in the Buddhist view composed of dhammas, or the real existent part of an object is are momentarily occurring dhammas. Time has also some difference of understanding between Theravada and Sarvastivada. And Sarvastivada, by the way, was one of the early schools of Buddhism, but it's extinct now as such, but it was a formative influence in particularly Tibetan Buddhism. A lot of their Abhidhamma understanding comes via the Sarvastivada. So it still has a strong influence. In the Theravada view, time is also ultimately unreal. And just as space is only measured and determined in terms of distance between objects, time only makes sense in terms of sequence of dhammas. And this was actually explicitly defined as against one of the non-Buddhist schools of philosophy that was current, was called the Kalavada, the school of time, that held that time was the only ultimate reality, and the flow of time was itself reality, and everything was created and consumed within that flow. And this is explicitly rejected in some of the later books, like the Katawatu of the Theravada, that said that time is not an existent real, that it's only it's like an abstraction or a mental convenience for ordering the sequence of events. A Dhamma exists only momentarily, and there was a concept of minimum unit of duration that was called a kana. It's usually translated as moment. A Dhamma only exists for a moment, and a mind moment is that which perceives a single Dhamma. And we measure time on a broader scale in terms of objects. Now, the day is the movement of the sun, or the rotation of the earth as we now understand it to be. One rotation of the earth is a day. One revolution of the earth around the sun is a year. And we can subdivide years into months and weeks, and days into hours and minutes and seconds, just as fractions of that primary unit, rotation or revolution. So the time is only defined in terms of a sequence of events. One of the epithets of Arahant is one who has ended time or escaped from time. Time, although it's a non-real, it's just an abstraction. It only makes any sense within the structure of the conditioned world. It's ultimately samsaric, because the whole structure of causes and conditions depends on a sequenced ordering of events. And outside of manifest objects and sequence of events and causes and conditions, there's only nibbana, and the whole concept of time is non-applicable. So, for example, we see in the Udana, when there's a long list of negative nouns that apply to nibbana, ajata, amata, asankata, so on, using a as the negative prefix in Pali, and in English it's like the unborn, the unaging, the undying, the uncreated, the unconditioned, so on. Nibbana is called amata, not dying or undying, which is not the same thing as everlasting or eternal. It's not born, it doesn't die. If the Buddha wanted to say it was everlasting or eternal, he would have used nitya, which means, eternal, lasting forever, extension through time. So it means it's outside of time. And we have one of the epithets of Dhamma, which we chant in the Atipiso. One of the epithets of Dhamma is akaliko, which means timeless, not subject to time. So time is part of the samsaric ordering of things. And it's in itself, it's only an abstraction. And another corollary of this, which is important to see the difference between Theravada and Sarvastivada, is that in Theravada, the real existent Dhamma is only existent at the present moment. So it's only the present moment that's real. The past has ceased to be and is utterly without reality, and the future is unmanifest, so it's utterly without reality. And it's only the present moment, which is a kana, which is an extremely brief period of time, that actually has a existent reality. The Sarvastivada, on the other hand, the name of the school, Sarvastivada, is Sanskrit, that means everything exists or all exists. Sarva is the Sanskrit equivalent of Sabha in Pali. And they held that past, present, and future all exist. And this can be understood in two ways that are really just two different ways of looking at the idea. They're actually not contradictory. One is that the citta, the knowing mind, is the eternal present. And it's moving through this field of existent reality, one moment at a time. So all of existence, past and future, is present, but citta only takes this into account, this moment it's moving through. But another way of seeing it is that it's not the citta that moves. The citta is eternally still in the present. And the dhammas are moving backwards through time. The dhammas are existing in the future, but they're constantly moving through the present into the past. And the citta is aware of these objects moving, and they fall away into the past. They arise in the future and they fall away into the past. Now, again, to make the comparison to modern understandings, first of all, mention that the idea of a khanna as an infinitesimal unit of time has something of an equivalent in physics with what's called a Planck moment and a Planck length, which in quantum understanding there's like this minimum unit of reality, and they're defined mathematically in a fairly complex way, but they're very infinitesimal, and they relate to each other in that it takes one Planck moment for light to cross one Planck length. And it's considered that anything smaller or briefer than that makes no sense. It can't be described in any kind of physical or mathematical way. This is the ultimately small unit. And there's also a problem. It's something of a unresolved, outstanding problem in physics, as they call the arrow of time. Because most of the mathematical descriptions of reality work whether you move forward or backward through time. But we have an overwhelming perception, it's universal perception of always moving from the past into the future, that there's a direction to time. And how this is generally understood is because of entropy. It's one of Newton's laws, is that there's always a tendency towards greater entropy. Entropy is always increasing, which means, simplified, it means disorder. That a highly ordered, structured state of things is low entropy, and it's always tending towards disorder. So that's very much in accord with Ajahn Chah's definition of impermanence, to say this glass is broken. You know? The idea of entropy too, in terms of a glass, is that if you break a glass, you drop it on the floor and it shatters. The movie never runs backwards. The glass pieces don't organize themselves into a glass. The shards don't organize themselves into a drinking glass. But the drinking glass can easily become disordered and become shards. So the theory is, like, at the moment of the Big Bang, the universe, because it was so simple, could be considered to have very low entropy. It was very like highly structured, symmetrical existent, and then it gradually unraveled. It's an increase of entropy. So in this way of thinking, there's no real arrow of time. There's only an increase of entropy. So if you think about it, that has some resonance, or at least it's somewhat compatible with the second way of looking at the Sarvastivada view, that the chitta is in an eternal present and that dhammas are streaming through from a condition of low entropy to a condition of high entropy. Another way of thinking about that vision, relating it to another aspect of modern understanding, is if we think of reality in the future as being an unfixed, unmanifest state. It's the quantum wave function, the probability function, that nothing is determined. There's only a field of probabilities, of unmanifest possibilities, which is ultimately taken all in whole. It's an infinite potential. But then as it becomes contacted by consciousness, then it resolves itself into particular occurrences. And then these cease to exist. They become the past, which only exists. It doesn't exist in itself as any kind of reality, but it can be deduced through memory and through the effects it has on the present. So, for example, if archaeologists dig up an ancient city and determine various descriptions of how people lived and what their life was like based on the artifacts, they're not actually dealing with the past. They're dealing with the present. Those remnants and fossils and stone buildings exist in the present, but they can be used to deduce some speculations about the past. So in the ancient Buddhist view, both Theravada and Sarvastivada, time was not a fundamental reality. It was an ordering of events. So it's specifically said in the Theravada Abhidhamma that as it is unreal and without actual substance, it's neither conditioned nor unconditioned. And finally, maybe one last comparison to Einstein's time, which is conditioned, because it flows at a different rate if you accelerate close to the speed of light. And it's relative to the observer. So there's no ultimate simultaneity in the relative universe. There's only time as perceived by the observer. So just to sum up these different views of time and space, I think the biggest point to understand here is that in the Abhidhamma view, only the Dhammas can be said to have a real existence, and that time and space are only abstractions for the ordering of Dhammas, whether it's their distance from each other in space or their sequence of occurrence in time. time and space themselves have no independent reality outside of the ordering of the Dhammas.